Echo 7.
We acknowledge receipt. The park is secure.
There is a region in the eastern mountains of the United States that locals do not speak of lightly. It has no official borders. It does not appear on any government map. But the people who have lived along these ridges for generations know exactly where it begins and where the rules of the forest start to bend. They call it the Appalachian Triangle. The area stretches loosely between Norton in Virginia, Harlan in Kentucky, and the high-ridge towns of eastern Tennessee. Some extend its edges into the deep hollows of North Carolina and the fog-covered slopes of West Virginia. The terrain is ancient. The Appalachian Mountains are among the oldest on Earth, worn down over 400 million years into rolling peaks and tangled valleys where the canopy blocks out the sun even at midday. Millions of hikers walk these trails every year. Most return home with photographs and tired legs and stories of beauty, but a small number do not return at all. And when investigators try to understand what happened, the answers do not come easily. This is not a story about monsters or conspiracies. It is a collection of documented cases, ranger logs, search reports, and interviews with people who know these mountains better than anyone. The accounts are calm, the details are specific, and the patterns they form do not fit into any official explanation. The Appalachian Triangle does not announce itself. It simply exists, and sometimes it keeps what walks into it. The first case that shaped the modern understanding of disappearances in this region involved a woman who should never have been lost. Thelma Pauline Melton was 58 years old when she vanished on September 25, 1981, in the Deep Creek area of the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. She was hiking with two close friends on a trail she had walked dozens of times before. The weather was clear. The path was well marked. There was no reason for concern. According to witness statements, Melton walked slightly ahead of her companions as the group moved along a gentle slope near a creek crossing. She stepped over a small rise and disappeared from view. Her friends expected to see her waiting on the other side. When they crested the rise seconds later, she was gone. They called her name. No answer. They searched the immediate area. No sign of her. Within the hour, park rangers arrived. By nightfall, a full search operation was underway. Over the following days, more than 100 searchers combed the terrain. Helicopters swept the canopy. Tracking dogs were brought in with scent articles taken from Melton's belongings. The dogs picked up her trail at the spot where she was last seen, followed it for a short distance, and stopped. The handlers reported that the scent simply ended. There was no indication of which direction she had gone. Rangers checked every drainage, every rock shelter, every thicket within a mile of the trail. They found nothing. No clothing, no footprints, no sign of a fall or a struggle. The official report noted that the area where Melton vanished was familiar terrain, with no significant hazards. She had been wearing bright clothing and was in good physical condition. The investigation continued for weeks, then months, then years. Melton's body was never recovered. No trace of her was ever found. The case remains open to this day. Her friends later told investigators that nothing unusual had occurred that morning. No strange sounds. No wildlife disturbance. The forest had been quiet. Almost too quiet, one of them said. But at the time, no one thought anything of it. If Thelma Pauline Melton could vanish on a trail she knew by heart, surrounded by friends, in broad daylight, the question was no longer whether the mountains could take someone. The question was how. The year before Melton disappeared, a seasonal ranger named Curtis Whitmore vanished under circumstances that would remain buried in the Jefferson National Forest archives for nearly 4 decades. Whitmore had been assigned to patrol the ridgeline trails above Norton, Virginia, during the summer of 1980. He was 34 years old, a former Army Ranger who had served 2 tours in Vietnam before joining the National Park Service. His supervisors described him as methodical, calm under pressure, and one of the most reliable field officers in the district. On the morning of July 7th, Whitmore signed out for a routine patrol along the Stone Mountain Trail. He carried a radio, a sidearm, and enough supplies for a day hike. His planned route would take him along the ridge and back to the station by early evening. At 2:47 p.m., Whitmore radioed dispatch to report that he had reached the junction near Keoki Lake. His voice was steady. He noted light fog moving in from the west, but said conditions were otherwise clear. That was his last transmission. When Whitmore failed to return by nightfall, a search team was dispatched. They found his vehicle at the trailhead, locked, with his personal gear still inside. Rangers walked the trail through the night with flashlights and called his name. No response. The following morning, a tracking team located a partial boot print near mile marker 6. The print matched Whitmore's issued footwear. Beyond that point, the trail showed no sign of passage, no broken branches, no disturbed leaves, no further prints. Searchers expanded the perimeter over the next 4 days. They brought in dogs from 3 counties. The dogs followed a scent from the boot print for approximately 200 yards, then circled and sat. The handlers noted that the trail did not continue in any direction. It simply stopped. On the 5th day, a volunteer found Whitmore's radio wedged between 2 rocks near a dry creek bed, roughly half a mile from where the prints had ended. The radio was intact. The battery was dead. The last log transmission matched the one received by dispatch. No other trace of Curtis Whitmore was ever found. His service weapon was never recovered. His body was never located. The official file lists his status as missing, presumed deceased, with cause undetermined. His commanding officer later wrote in a personal note attached to the file, "Curtis knew these mountains as well as any man alive. If something took him, it did not give him a chance to fight back." Another case comes from the Tennessee side of the triangle and involves a man whose experience should have made him immune to the dangers of the wilderness. Harold Birkhart was a retired game warden who had spent 31 years working the forests of eastern Tennessee. He knew the animal trails, the water sources, the hidden clearings where poachers like to set their traps. After retirement, he continued to walk the same ridges, often alone, mapping changes in the terrain and noting shifts in wildlife patterns. On October 14, 2012, Birkhart left his cabin near Caryville to check on a series of trail cameras he had placed along the Cumberland Gap. He told his wife he would be back before dark. He carried a GPS unit, a 2-way radio, and a small pack with water and first aid supplies. At 4:16 p.m., he sent a text message to his daughter. "Cameras look good. Heading back now. Fog coming in fast." That was the last anyone heard from him. When Birkhart did not return by nightfall, his wife contacted the Campbell County Sheriff's Office. Deputies arrived at the trailhead within the hour. They found his truck parked at the usual spot, locked, with nothing disturbed. The search that followed involved more than 60 volunteers, 2 helicopters, and a K-9 unit from Knoxville. Over 7 days, teams covered more than 40 square miles of terrain. The dogs picked up Birkhart's scent near the first camera location, but lost it within a quarter mile. Handlers said the trail did not fade gradually. It cut off sharply, as if he had stepped off the ground entirely. One of the trail cameras Birkhart had been checking was recovered on the 3rd day. The memory card contained images from the previous week, including several of deer, a black bear, and 2 hikers passing through. The final image, time-stamped 4:09 p.m. on October 14th, showed Birkhart himself standing near a fallen oak tree. His expression was calm. He appeared to be looking at something off-frame to his left. The next image, taken 7 minutes later, showed only the empty trail. Searchers focused heavily on the area near that camera. They found no sign of disturbance, no tracks leading away, no evidence of an animal encounter or a fall. The leaves on the ground were undisturbed. The fog that Birkhart had mentioned was noted in weather logs, but conditions had cleared by the following morning. His GPS unit was never found. Neither was his body. The official report concluded that Birkhart likely suffered a medical emergency and wandered off the trail before succumbing to the elements. His family disputed this conclusion, noting that he had no history of health problems and had walked that exact route more than 50 times in the previous year. His daughter later told a local newspaper, "He knew those woods better than he knew our living room. If he got lost, It's because the woods wanted him lost. Another case dates to the winter of 2018 and involves a group of 3 hunters from Kentucky who entered the Jefferson National Forest for a weekend trip that would end with only 2 of them walking out. The men were brothers-in-law, all in their late 30s, all experienced outdoorsmen who had hunted together for more than a decade. They set up camp near the Big Stone Gap on the Virginia side of the border on the evening of November 16th. The weather was cold, but clear. They planned to hunt deer along the ridgeline the following morning. According to the 2 survivors, the group split up around 7:30 a.m. on November 17th. Each man took a different position along the slope, spaced roughly 300 yards apart. They communicated by radio, checking in every 30 minutes as planned. The first 2 check-ins were normal. At 8:30 a.m., the man in the center position, a 38-year-old named Randall Combs, reported seeing movement in the brush below him. He said he was going to move closer for a better view. That was his last transmission. When Combs failed to respond at the 9 a.m. check-in, the other 2 hunters converged on his position. They found his pack leaning against a tree, his rifle propped beside it, and his radio sitting on a flat rock. There was no sign of Combs himself. The hunters searched the immediate area for more than an hour, calling his name and firing signal shots. No response. They marked the location and hiked out to contact authorities. The search that followed lasted 9 days. More than 80 people participated, including members of the Virginia State Police and a tracking team from the Forest Service. Dogs were brought in on the second day. They picked up Combs's scent near the pack and followed it downhill for approximately 400 yards before losing it at a creek crossing. Divers checked the creek. It was shallow, less than 2 feet deep, with a rocky bottom. No body, no clothing, no sign of passage. One detail from the search stood out. A volunteer found a single boot print in the mud near the creek bank. The print matched Combs's footwear, but the print was facing uphill, back toward the position where his gear had been found. Investigators could not explain why he would have turned around or why there were no additional prints in either direction. Randall Combs was never found. His hunting license, wallet, and vehicle keys were still in his pack. His rifle had not been fired. The official report listed his disappearance as unexplained. One of the surviving hunters later gave an interview to a regional podcast. He said the forest had felt different that morning. Not dangerous, just still, like everything was waiting for something to happen. The next case takes us back to the heart of the Great Smoky Mountains and a young man who left behind a note that has puzzled investigators for more than a decade. Derek Luing was 23 years old when he arrived at the Elkmont campground in March 2012. He had driven from his home in the Midwest with a truck full of new camping gear, telling friends he needed time alone to clear his head. He checked into a campsite on March 15th and was last seen by other campers that evening. Sometime during the night, Luing left a handwritten note on the dashboard of his truck. The note read, "Please don't come looking for me. I know what I'm doing." By morning, he was gone. Rangers initiated a search after another camper reported the note. They found Luing's tent still pitched at his campsite, his sleeping bag unrolled inside. His wallet, phone, and keys were sitting on a picnic table. His boots were beside the fire ring. He had apparently walked into the forest barefoot or in socks. Search teams spent the next 2 weeks covering the terrain around Elkmont. They checked every trail, every drainage, every old logging road within a 5-mile radius. Dogs tracked his scent from the campsite into the forest, but lost it within a few hundred yards. Helicopters flew grid patterns over the canopy. Ground teams walked shoulder to shoulder through the underbrush. Nothing. No footprints. No torn clothing. No sign of a camp or a shelter. Derek Luing had walked into the Smokies and vanished as completely as if he had never existed. The note he left behind suggested that his disappearance was intentional, but the manner of it raised questions. Why leave all his gear? Why walk barefoot into terrain that would shred unprotected feet within minutes? And if he wanted to disappear, why leave his vehicle and identification behind? Some investigators believed he may have planned to end his life and simply walked until he could walk no more. Others noted that the search area was not particularly remote, and that a body should have been found within days. His family maintained that Derek had been struggling, but was not suicidal. They believed something in the forest had drawn him away from his camp. They did not speculate on what that something might have been. Derek Luing remains missing. His case is still open. Another case occurred in November 2024 and involves one of the most intensive search efforts in recent Appalachian history. Charles Hossh was 67 years old, a law professor from Texas, a former Eagle Scout, and an experienced hiker who had completed the Blood Mountain Trail in Georgia numerous times. On November 11th, he set out for what was supposed to be a routine day hike to the summit. He told family members he would be back by late afternoon. He never returned. Search teams were deployed within hours of his family reporting him overdue. Over the following days, more than 100 personnel joined the effort, including rangers, volunteers, and members of the Union County Sheriff's Office. Helicopters equipped with thermal imaging flew over the terrain. Drones scanned the forest floor. Dogs were brought in from 3 states. The search focused on the areas Hossh was most likely to have traveled. Investigators noted that he was a creature of habit who typically followed the same routes. They believed he had attempted to descend the mountain, but lost his way in the fading light. Despite the massive effort, no trace of Hossh was found during the first week. No footprints, no dropped items, no signals from any electronic device. The terrain was steep and heavily forested, but searchers had covered it thoroughly. Some volunteers walked the same sections multiple times without finding a single clue. As of this writing, Charles Hossh remains missing. His family has asked the public to check any trail cameras in the area for footage that might show his movements. The search continues in limited mode. A statement from his law firm read, "Charles is a creature of habit. We believe he intended to hike down Blood Mountain, but lost his way. This information is helping search teams focus their efforts along the most likely path he would have taken." But some who followed the case noted a troubling detail. The path Charles would have taken on his return was the same path he had walked dozens of times before. He knew it as well as he knew the hallways of his own office. If a man with his experience could vanish on a trail he had memorized, the question was no longer about skill or preparation. The question was whether the mountain itself had decided not to let him leave. Another case comes from the Virginia side of the Blue Ridge and involves a woman whose profession should have made her one of the most capable people in the forest. Karen Weiss was a wildlife biologist who had spent 11 years studying black bear populations in the Shenandoah Valley. She knew the terrain, the animal behavior, the weather patterns. Her colleagues described her as meticulous and cautious, someone who never took unnecessary risks. On September 3, 2019, Weiss left her research station near Waynesboro to check a series of monitoring stations along the Appalachian Trail. She drove to the trailhead at Rockfish Gap, signed the register at 8:14 a.m., and began her hike. Her planned route would take her along a 6-mile loop that she had walked more than 100 times. She carried a radio, a GPS beacon, and a satellite phone. Her estimated return time was 3 p.m. At 11:47 a.m., Weiss activated her GPS beacon to mark a waypoint near one of her monitoring stations. The coordinates showed her position as approximately 2 miles from the trailhead, exactly where she should have been at that time. That was her last recorded activity. When Weiss did not return by evening, her colleagues contacted park authorities. Rangers found her vehicle at the trailhead, locked and undisturbed. Her name was still in the register with no sign-out time recorded. The search began the following morning. Teams followed the trail to the waypoint she had marked and found her monitoring station intact. Data from the equipment showed that she had downloaded readings at 11:52 a.m. The procedure would have taken approximately 5 minutes. Beyond that point, there was no sign of her. Dogs tracked her scent from the station for roughly 300 yards before losing it near a rocky outcrop. Handlers noted that the scent did not fade gradually. It stopped as if she had been lifted off the ground. Searchers checked every drainage, every cliff face, every gap in the terrain within a 2-mile radius. They found nothing. No clothing, no equipment, no footprints beyond the outcrop. Her GPS beacon, Radio and satellite phone were never recovered. The official investigation concluded that Weiss likely suffered an accident in the rocky terrain and that her body may have fallen into a crevice or been carried away by animals. Her colleagues disputed this conclusion, noting that she was intimately familiar with every hazard in the area and that the terrain showed no sign of recent disturbance. One of her fellow researchers later wrote in a memorial, "Karen knew every rock and route on that trail. If something happened to her, it wasn't because she made a mistake. It was because the mountain had other plans." The following case involves a father and son who entered the Cherokee National Forest in the fall of 2021 for a weekend hunting trip that would leave one of them walking out alone. Martin Reeves was 54 years old, a retired firefighter from Chattanooga who had been hunting in these mountains since childhood. His son Tyler was 26, an Army veteran who had served 2 deployments overseas. Both men were skilled outdoorsmen, comfortable in terrain that would challenge most hikers. They set up camp near the Okie River on the evening of October 8th. The weather was cool and clear. They planned to hunt turkey along the ridgeline the following morning. According to Tyler's statement to investigators, the 2 men separated around 6:30 a.m. on October 9th. Martin took a position higher on the slope, while Tyler stayed near the creek. They communicated by hand signals across the distance, checking in visually every few minutes. At approximately 7:15 a.m., Tyler saw his father wave from his position on the ridge. He waved back. When he looked up again a few minutes later, his father was gone. Tyler assumed Martin had moved to a different position. He waited 30 minutes, then hiked up to where his father had been standing. He found Martin's pack leaning against a tree and his shotgun propped beside it. There was no sign of Martin himself. Tyler searched the area for more than 2 hours, calling his father's name and firing signal shots. No response. He marked the location with orange tape and hiked out to contact authorities. The search that followed lasted 12 days. More than 70 people participated, including members of the Tennessee Wildlife Resources Agency and a tracking team from the FBI. Dogs picked up Martin's scent near the pack and followed it downhill for approximately 500 yards before losing it at a steep drop-off. Searchers rappelled down the cliff face. They found nothing. No body, no clothing, no sign of a fall. The rocks below were undisturbed. One detail from the investigation stood out. A hunter in an adjacent area reported hearing what sounded like a man's voice calling for help around 7:30 a.m. on October 9th. The voice came from the direction of the ridge where Martin had been positioned. The hunter said the voice called out 3 times, then stopped. He did not investigate because he assumed it was another hunter communicating with his group. Martin Reeves was never found. The official report listed his disappearance as unexplained. His son Tyler later told a local news station that he had replayed that morning in his mind 1,000 times. "I saw him wave," Tyler said. "He was right there. And then he wasn't. I don't know how to explain it. One second he was standing on that ridge, and the next second the ridge was empty." Another case brings us to a stretch of trail in western North Carolina that has accumulated more than its share of unexplained incidents. Raymond Costa was a retired Marine Corps sergeant who had served 22 years in the military before settling in Asheville. He was 61 years old, in excellent physical condition, and spent most of his free time hiking the trails around the Blue Ridge Parkway. On April 18, 2017, Costa set out to hike a 12-mile loop near Craggy Gardens. He had completed the same route more than 20 times. He carried a day pack with water, food, a first aid kit, and a handheld radio. His wife expected him home by 6 p.m. At 2:34 p.m., Costa called his wife from a scenic overlook near the midpoint of the loop. He said the weather was perfect and he was making good time. He told her he would see her in a few hours. That was the last time anyone heard from him. When Costa failed to return by evening, his wife contacted the Buncombe County Sheriff's Office. Deputies located his vehicle at the trailhead and initiated a search the following morning. Teams followed the trail to the overlook where Costa had made his phone call. The call had been logged by the cellular tower, confirming his location. Beyond that point, the trail showed no sign of his passage. Dogs tracked his scent from the overlook for approximately 400 yards before stopping at a junction where the main trail split into two paths. The dogs circled the junction multiple times, but could not determine which direction Costa had taken. Handlers noted that the scent appeared to end at the junction rather than continuing along either path. Searchers walked both trails multiple times. They checked every side path, every drainage, every rock shelter within a mile of the junction. They found nothing. On the fourth day, a volunteer discovered Costa's water bottle near the base of a large oak tree, approximately 200 yards from the main trail. The bottle was half full and showed no sign of damage. It was sitting upright on a flat rock, as if someone had placed it there deliberately. No other trace of Raymond Costa was ever found. His radio was never recovered. His body was never located. The official report noted that the area where his water bottle was found had been searched twice before, without any sighting of the bottle. Investigators could not explain how it appeared in a location that had already been cleared. His wife later told reporters that Raymond had been unusually quiet in the days before his hike. She asked him if something was wrong. He said he kept having the same dream, over and over. He was walking a trail he knew by heart, and every time he reached a certain point, the trail split into two paths. Both paths looked identical, and no matter which one he chose, he ended up back at the same junction. She asked him what happened next. He said he always woke up before he found out. The next case occurred in the winter of 2023 and involved circumstances so unusual that the investigators who worked it still refuse to discuss certain details publicly. Alan Driscoll was a 44-year-old park ranger assigned to the Cumberland Gap National Historical Park. He had worked for the National Park Service for 16 years and knew the trails in his jurisdiction as well as anyone alive. On the morning of January 22nd, Driscoll signed out for a routine patrol along the Wilderness Road Trail. The weather was cold, but clear, with temperatures in the low 20s. He carried standard equipment: radio, GPS, sidearm, and a pack with emergency supplies. At 10:17 a.m., Driscoll radioed dispatch to report that he had reached the Iron Furnace Historic Site. His transmission was calm and routine. He noted that the trail conditions were good and that he was continuing east toward the ridge. At 11:03 a.m., dispatch received a second transmission from Driscoll. This one was different. His voice was lower, almost a whisper. He said, "I'm at the junction near Hensley Settlement. Something is wrong with the trail. The markers don't match. I'm turning back." Dispatch asked him to clarify. There was no response. They tried to reach him again at 11:15, 11:30, and 11:45. Nothing. A search team was deployed by early afternoon. They found Driscoll's vehicle at the trailhead, locked and undisturbed. They walked the trail to the iron furnace and found boot prints matching his size heading east, exactly as he had reported. The prints continued for approximately 1 mile beyond the furnace. Then they stopped. Not gradually. Not at a junction or a clearing. The prints simply ended in the middle of the trail, as if Driscoll had taken one step and not taken another. Dogs were brought in the following day. They tracked his scent from the end of the prints for approximately 300 yards in a direction perpendicular to the trail. The scent led into a dense thicket and stopped at a rock wall. Handlers searched both sides of the wall. They found nothing. Over the next week, more than 40 searchers covered the terrain. They found Driscoll's radio wedged into a crevice in the rock wall, approximately 20 feet above ground level. The radio was intact, but the battery had been removed. The battery was never found. No other trace of Alan Driscoll was recovered. His GPS unit was never located. His body was never found. The official report listed his disappearance as unexplained. Several details from the investigation were classified as sensitive and withheld from public records. A colleague who worked with Driscoll later spoke to a journalist off the record. He said that Driscoll had mentioned the junction near Hensley Settlement several times in the weeks before his disappearance. He said the trail there felt different than it used to. Not dangerous, just different. Like the trees had moved closer together without anyone noticing. When asked what he thought happened, the colleague said he had no idea, but he added that Driscoll was not a man who scared easily, and in that last transmission, his voice sounded scared. Across these 10 cases, certain patterns emerge. The victims are not novices or thrill-seekers. They are rangers, hunters, biologists, veterans, and retired professionals who knew these mountains as well as anyone. They carried proper equipment. They followed established routes. They did everything right, and still they vanished. In most cases, tracking dogs lose the scent abruptly, as if the person simply stopped existing at a specific point on the trail. In several cases, personal items appear in locations that had already been searched. In nearly all cases, the weather was clear, the terrain was familiar, and there was no obvious hazard that could explain the disappearance. The Appalachian Triangle does not demand belief. It simply accumulates evidence, case by case, year by year, name by name. If you have followed this far, you already understand that these are not stories with endings. They are questions that remain open. Some will be answered. Most will not. The mountains continue to draw millions of visitors every year. Most walk in and walk out without incident, but a small number step onto a trail they know by heart and never reach the other side. What happens to them? Where do they go? The forest does not answer. It simply waits. If these cases matter to you, consider sharing this with someone who spends time in the wilderness, not as a warning, just as a reminder that the familiar can become unfamiliar in an instant. And sometimes, the trail home is not as straight as it appears. If these patterns mean anything, consider what they suggest. The familiar can become unfamiliar in an instant, and sometimes the trail home is not as straight as it appears. The following case involves a detail that separates it from almost every other disappearance recorded in the Appalachian Triangle. The missing man was not hiking alone. He was leading a search party for someone else. Nathan Crawley was a 52-year-old volunteer coordinator for the Weiss County Search and Rescue Team in Virginia. He had participated in more than 200 operations over 18 years, recovering lost hikers, stranded hunters, and accident victims from some of the most remote terrain in the region. His colleagues described him as unflappable, the kind of man who stayed calm when others panicked. On March 14, 2020, Crawley was called to assist in a search for a missing hunter near the Kentucky border. The hunter had been reported overdue the previous evening, and ground teams had been working through the night without success. Crawley arrived at the command post at 6:30 a.m. and was assigned to lead a 6-person team into a drainage basin that had not yet been checked. The terrain was steep and heavily wooded, with limited visibility once you dropped below the ridgeline. The team entered the basin around 8 a.m. They maintained radio contact with the command post, checking in every 30 minutes as protocol required. At 9:30 a.m., Crawley reported that the team was approaching a creek junction at the bottom of the drainage. He said visibility was poor due to fog, but that conditions were otherwise normal. At 10 a.m., the team checked in again. One of the members reported that Crawley had walked ahead to scout the opposite bank of the creek. The rest of the team was waiting at the junction. At 10:15 a.m., the team radioed that Crawley had not returned. They had called his name multiple times with no response. They requested instructions from the command post. By noon, a second team had been deployed to assist. They found the original team still waiting at the creek junction. The creek was shallow, no more than knee-deep, with a rocky bottom and clear water. There was no sign of Crawley on either bank. Over the following week, more than 90 searchers covered the drainage basin and the surrounding terrain. Dogs tracked Crawley's scent from the creek junction for approximately 100 yards downstream, then lost it at a point where the creek passed between two large boulders. Divers checked the pools. Nothing. One member of the original team later gave a statement that troubled investigators. He said that before Crawley walked ahead to scout, he had paused and looked upstream for several seconds. When asked what he was looking at, Crawley said he thought he heard someone calling from that direction. The team member listened, but heard nothing. Nathan Crawley was never found. The hunter he had been searching for was located the following day, disoriented but alive, nearly 4 miles from the drainage basin where Crawley vanished. The official report noted the irony without comment. A man who had spent 2 decades finding the lost became one of the lost himself. Another case comes from the North Carolina side of the Triangle and involves a woman whose training should have prepared her for any situation the wilderness could present. Denise Harmon was a 46-year-old paramedic who worked for the Buncombe County Emergency Medical Services. She had spent 20 years responding to calls in the mountains, often hiking into remote areas to reach injured patients. Her colleagues said she could navigate terrain in the dark that most people would struggle with in daylight. On August 7, 2016, Harmon set out for a solo day hike along the Mountains to Sea Trail near the Blue Ridge Parkway. She had completed the same section at least a dozen times. She carried a full pack with medical supplies, water, food, and a GPS unit. She told her husband she would be back by 4 p.m. At 11:22 a.m., Harmon sent a text message to a coworker. "Trail is quiet today. Haven't seen another person in 2 hours. Kinda nice." At 1:15 p.m., her husband received a phone call from her cell. He answered, but the line was silent except for what he described as a low humming sound, like wind passing through a narrow space. The call lasted 11 seconds before disconnecting. He tried to call back immediately. The phone rang once and went to voicemail. When Harmon did not return by evening, her husband contacted park authorities. Rangers located her vehicle at the trailhead the following morning. Her name was in the register with no sign-out time. Search teams followed the trail for more than 8 miles without finding any sign of her. Dogs tracked her scent from the trailhead for approximately 3 miles, then lost it at a section of trail that crossed a rocky outcrop. Handlers noted that the scent did not fade. It simply stopped. On the 4th day, a volunteer found Harmon's GPS unit wedged into a crack in the rocks near the outcrop. The device was intact and showed her route up to that point. The last recorded waypoint was time-stamped 12:47 p.m., roughly 30 minutes before the silent phone call to her husband. Beyond that waypoint, the GPS showed no additional data. Either the device had been turned off or it had stopped recording for reasons that could not be determined. No other trace of Denise Harmon was ever found. Her pack, phone, and medical supplies were never recovered. The official investigation concluded that she likely suffered an accident in the rocky terrain, though no evidence of such an accident was discovered. Her husband later told investigators that the humming sound on the phone call had stayed with him. He said it did not sound like wind. It sounded deliberate, like something breathing into the receiver from very close. The next case dates to the autumn of 2014 and involves a pair of brothers who had hunted together in the Jefferson National Forest for more than 30 years. William and Thomas Atkins were both in their early 60s, retired coal miners from Weiss County, who spent every October in the same stretch of forest their father and grandfather had hunted before them. They knew the terrain by heart. They had names for individual trees and rock formations. The forest was as familiar to them as their own homes. On October 19th, they drove to their usual trailhead near High Knob and hiked to a campsite they had used since childhood. They set up their tent, built a fire, and turned in early to prepare for the morning hunt. According to William's later statement, he woke around 3 a.m. to use the latrine they had dug near the camp. When he returned to the tent, Thomas was gone. His sleeping bag was unzipped, and his boots were still beside his cot. William assumed his brother had also stepped out for the same reason. He waited. 15 minutes passed. Then, 30. He called Thomas's name. No answer. He walked the perimeter of the camp with a flashlight, checking every direction. Nothing. By dawn, William had searched the immediate area multiple times. He hiked out to the trailhead and drove to the nearest town to contact the sheriff's office. The search that followed lasted 11 days. More than 50 volunteers joined rangers and deputies in covering the terrain around the campsite. Dogs tracked Thomas's scent from the tent in multiple directions, none of which led more than 100 yards before fading. One detail stood out. A partial footprint was found in soft soil approximately 80 yards from the camp. The print was consistent with a bare foot, roughly Thomas's size. It was the only print found outside the immediate campsite area. The print was facing away from the camp, toward a steep ravine that dropped nearly 200 feet to a creek below. Searchers rappelled into the ravine and walked its entire length. They found nothing. Thomas Atkins was never found. No clothing, no remains, no equipment. He had walked out of his tent in the middle of the night, barefoot, and vanished into terrain he had known for 60 years. William gave only one interview after the search ended. He said his brother had been acting normally in the days before the trip. No signs of confusion or illness. No reason to wander off in the dark. When asked if he had any theory about what happened, William was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Thomas told me once that the forest feels different at night, like it's a different place entirely. I always thought he was just being poetic. Now I'm not sure." Another case involves a young woman whose disappearance in 2022 remains one of the most actively investigated in recent years. Megan Ashford was a 29-year-old wildlife photographer from Knoxville who specialized in documenting the fauna of the Great Smoky Mountains. She had published work in regional magazines and maintained a popular social media account featuring her images of black bears, elk, and wild turkeys. On May 3, 2022, Ashford entered the park through the Cades Cove entrance, planning to photograph spring wildflowers along the Abrams Falls Trail. She checked in at the ranger station and told the attendant she expected to be out by mid-afternoon. Her last known activity was a photograph posted to her social media account at 10:47 a.m. The image showed a cluster of trillium flowers growing beside the trail. The caption read, "Spring is finally here. The forest is waking up." When Ashford did not return by evening, park rangers initiated a search. They found her vehicle in the parking area, locked, with her purse visible on the passenger seat. Her camera bag was missing. Over the following 2 weeks, more than 100 searchers covered the Abrams Falls Trail and the surrounding terrain. Dogs tracked her scent from the parking area to a point approximately 2 miles along the trail, near a footbridge over Abrams Creek. The scent stopped at the bridge and did not continue on either side. Divers checked the creek below the bridge. The water was fast-moving, but shallow. They found no body, no clothing, no camera equipment. On the 9th day, a hiker reported finding a lens cap approximately half a mile off the main trail, in an area of dense rhododendron that was difficult to access. Rangers confirmed the lens cap was consistent with Ashford's camera equipment. They searched the surrounding area intensively, but found nothing else. The discovery raised questions. The area where the lens cap was found was not on any established path. If Ashford had gone there deliberately, she would have had to push through thick underbrush for more than 20 minutes. There was no obvious reason for her to do so. Megan Ashford remains missing. Her camera and photographs from that day have never been recovered. The official investigation continues, though active search operations have been scaled back. Her father gave an interview to a Knoxville news station several months after her disappearance. He said Megan had been in excellent spirits before the trip. She had called him the night before to say she was excited about the light conditions forecast for the following day. He said he keeps checking her social media account, hoping for another post. The trillium photograph is still there. It has been liked thousands of times by people who do not know it was the last image she ever shared. The next case takes us to the Kentucky side of the triangle, and a man whose profession demanded that he understand how people become lost. Richard Saylor was a 58-year-old psychology professor at Eastern Kentucky University who had spent 2 decades researching spatial disorientation and decision-making in wilderness environments. He had published extensively on why hikers make the choices that lead them astray. He had consulted with search and rescue teams across the region. On November 8, 2018, Saylor drove to the Natural Bridge State Resort Park for what he described to colleagues as a research outing. He planned to hike several trails he had used in previous studies and take notes on wayfinding markers and trail conditions. He signed the register at the trailhead at 9:15 a.m. and headed toward the Balanced Rock Trail, a moderate loop that most hikers complete in under 2 hours. At 11:30 a.m., a park employee saw Saylor near the observation platform at Natural Bridge. The employee later recalled that Saylor was standing still, looking toward the tree line to the west, and appeared to be listening to something. The employee waved. Saylor did not respond. That was the last confirmed sighting. When Saylor did not return to his vehicle by late afternoon, park staff initiated a search. They found his pack at the observation platform, leaning against a railing. His notebook was inside, open to a page with a single handwritten line. Sound from the northwest. Not mechanical. Investigating. Dogs tracked his scent from the platform toward the tree line he had been facing. The trail led approximately 300 yards into the forest before ending at a dry creek bed. The handlers reported that the scent stopped at the creek bed and did not continue on either bank or in either direction along the channel. Searchers spent the next 6 days covering the terrain. They found a single item, Saylor's pen, lying on a flat rock near the creek bed, approximately 10 yards from where the scent trail ended. The pen was uncapped, as if he had been writing when he dropped it. Richard Saylor was never found. His colleagues noted the bitter irony that a man who had devoted his career to understanding how people become lost had become lost himself in a park he had visited hundreds of times. His final notebook entry has been analyzed extensively. Some believe he heard an animal or another hiker and simply went to investigate. Others note that the phrase, "not mechanical," suggests he was trying to identify something he could not immediately explain. The notebook remains in evidence. The sound he heard was never identified. Another case occurred in the summer of 2019 and involves a group of 4 experienced backpackers, 3 of whom walked out of the forest. The 4th did not. The group consisted of 2 married couples from Atlanta who had been hiking together for more than a decade. They planned a 5-day trek along the Benton-McKay Trail in the Cherokee National Forest, a route they had completed twice before. On the 3rd day of the trip, July 16th, the group reached a campsite near Big Frog Mountain. The weather had been clear and warm, with temperatures in the high 70s. They set up their tents, cooked dinner, and went to sleep around 9 p.m. According to the 3 survivors, they woke the following morning to find one of the tents empty. The missing man, a 43-year-old architect named David Brennan, had vanished during the night. His sleeping bag was still zipped. His boots were beside his cot. His headlamp was hanging from the tent loop where he had left it. The group searched the immediate area and called his name for more than an hour. No response. They hiked to the nearest trailhead and contacted authorities. The search that followed lasted 8 days. Dogs tracked Brennan's scent from the tent in a single direction, heading north toward the ridgeline. The trail continued for approximately 400 yards before stopping at a granite ledge overlooking a steep valley. Searchers rappelled into the valley. They found nothing. No body, no clothing, no sign of a fall. The ledge showed no disturbance, no marks that would indicate someone had slipped or jumped. One of the surviving group members gave a detail that investigators found difficult to explain. He said that around 2 a.m., he had woken briefly and heard what sounded like footsteps outside his tent. The footsteps were soft and evenly spaced, like someone walking calmly rather than stumbling. He assumed it was one of the others using the latrine and went back to sleep. When asked if he heard anything else, he said the forest had been completely silent. No insects, no wind, just the footsteps, moving away from the camp. David Brennan was never found. His wife later told reporters that he had no history of sleepwalking and no reason to leave the tent in the middle of the night. She said he was a careful man who planned everything in advance. She said the hardest part was not knowing, not whether he was alive or dead, but what had pulled him out of his tent on a calm summer night and led him to a place where no one could follow. The following case comes from the Virginia Highlands and involves a man whose job required him to be prepared for anything. Frank DeLuca was a 49-year-old fire management officer for the George Washington National Forest. He had spent 23 years working in wildland fire suppression and prevention, often hiking into remote areas to assess conditions and clear potential hazards. On September 2, 2021, DeLuca signed out from the Dry River Ranger Station for a routine inspection along the Shenandoah Mountain Trail. He planned to check several fire breaks and survey damage from a storm that had passed through the week before. His estimated return time was 5 p.m. At 2:14 p.m., Duca radioed the station to report that he had completed his inspection and was beginning his return hike. He noted that a thick fog was moving in from the west, but said he expected to beat it back to the trailhead. At 3:45 p.m., the station received a second transmission. Duca's voice was calm, but quieter than usual. He said, "I'm at the fork near mile marker 7. The fog is heavier than I expected. I'm having trouble with my compass. It keeps pointing in different directions." The dispatcher asked him to clarify. Duca said, "The needle won't settle. It's spinning. I've never seen it do this before." The dispatcher advised him to stay on the main trail and navigate by landmarks. Duca acknowledged and signed off. There were no further transmissions. When Duca failed to return by evening, a search team was dispatched. They found his vehicle at the trailhead, locked and undisturbed. Rangers walked the trail through the fog with flashlights, calling his name. No response. The following morning, the fog had lifted. Search teams located the fork Duca had mentioned near mile marker 7. His pack was leaning against a trail marker, and his compass was lying on the ground beside it. The compass needle was pointing steadily north. Dogs tracked his scent from the fork along a side trail that led toward a rocky overlook. The scent continued for approximately 200 yards, then stopped at a section of trail where the trees grew close together on both sides. Searchers found no sign of passage beyond that point. No broken branches, no footprints, no clothing caught on thorns. The trail continued for another mile to the overlook, but there was no evidence Duca had walked it. His radio was found 6 days later by a hiker, partially buried in leaf litter approximately half a mile from where the scent trail ended. The radio was intact. The battery was dead. The power switch was in the off position. Frank Duca was never found. The official report noted his comment about the compass, but offered no explanation for the phenomenon. His colleagues at the ranger station said they had never heard of a compass behaving that way in the area, though some mentioned that certain sections of the mountain contained iron deposits that could theoretically affect magnetic instruments. When asked about Duca's state of mind, his supervisor said he had been the same as always that morning. Focused, professional, looking forward to the hike. The supervisor paused, then added, "Frank knew those trails better than anyone. If his compass was acting strange, I believe him. And if something made him leave his pack behind, I believe that too. I just don't know what it was." Another case involves a husband and wife who entered the Nantahala National Forest in the fall of 2017 for an anniversary trip that would end with only one of them returning. Paul and Linda Garrett had been married for 32 years. Both were retired teachers from Charlotte who had spent their careers inspiring students to appreciate the natural world. They hiked together every weekend and had completed sections of the Appalachian Trail spanning 5 states. On October 7, 2017, they parked at the Weiss trailhead and began a planned 8-mile loop that they had completed several times before. The weather was cool and clear, with peak fall foliage coloring the ridges. According to Linda's later statement, they reached the fire tower at Weiss around noon and stopped to eat lunch. The view was spectacular. They took photographs and signed the guest register. Around 1 p.m., they began their descent along the return trail. At approximately 1:30 p.m., they reached a section where the trail crossed a small stream via stepping stones. Linda crossed first. When she turned to watch Paul cross, he was standing on the far bank, looking back down the trail the way they had come. She asked him what was wrong. He said he thought he heard someone calling his name. Linda listened. She heard nothing but the water and the wind. Paul continued to look back. Then he said he was going to check, just to make sure no one needed help. He told her to wait. Linda waited for 15 minutes. She called his name. No answer. She walked back along the trail to the point where she had last seen him. He was not there. She searched for more than an hour, calling his name, walking every visible path. Nothing. She hiked out to the trailhead and contacted rangers. The search lasted 10 days. More than 60 people covered the terrain between the stream crossing and Weiss. Dogs tracked Paul's scent from the stream in the direction he had been looking, back up the trail. The scent continued for approximately 300 yards before stopping at a switchback. Searchers found nothing at the switchback. No pack, no clothing, no sign of disturbance. Paul Garrett had walked back up a trail he had just descended and vanished before reaching the point where they had eaten lunch an hour earlier. Linda was interviewed multiple times. She was consistent in every detail. She said Paul had seemed normal that morning, happy even, excited about the hike. She said the only unusual thing was the way he had stopped at the stream, the way he tilted his head, like he was listening to something she could not hear, and the certainty in his voice when he said someone had called his name. She said she replays that moment constantly. She wonders what would have happened if she had gone with him. She wonders if she would have heard it too. The next case dates to the spring of 2023 and involves a man whose training had taken him to the most dangerous places on Earth. Marcus Cole was a 38-year-old former Special Forces operator who had served 3 combat deployments before transitioning to civilian life. He worked as a wilderness survival instructor, teaching courses on navigation, shelter construction, and emergency medicine. His students included law enforcement officers, search and rescue volunteers, and military personnel. On April 22, 2023, Cole entered the Pisgah National Forest for what he described to friends as a personal training exercise. He planned to spend 72 hours in the backcountry with minimal equipment, testing techniques he taught in his courses. He checked in with a friend via satellite messenger at 8 a.m. on the first day, again at 8 p.m., and again at 8 a.m. on the second day. Each message was brief: coordinates, weather conditions, status, all normal. The 8 p.m. check-in on the second day did not come. His friend waited until the following morning, then contacted local authorities. Rangers located Cole's vehicle at the trailhead and began a search. Over the next 12 days, more than 80 searchers covered the terrain. Dogs tracked Cole's scent from his last reported coordinates for approximately 1 mile, then lost it at a section of trail that passed through a narrow gorge. One item was recovered: Cole's satellite messenger, found wedged between rocks at the bottom of the gorge. The device showed that a message had been composed at 7:47 p.m. on the second day, but never sent. The message read, "Something moving parallel, not animal, going dark. Will contact when clear." The device's transmission log showed no outgoing messages after 8 a.m. that morning. The message at 7:47 p.m. had been typed, but not transmitted. Marcus Cole was never found. His instructors' community was stunned. Several colleagues noted that Cole was not a man who spooked easily. He had operated in environments where hostile forces actively hunted him. He had survived situations that would have killed most people. One former student said, "If Marcus went dark, he had a reason, and if he didn't come back out, something stopped him. I don't know what could do that to a man like him. I don't want to know." Another case returns us to the heart of the Great Smoky Mountains, where the pattern that defines the Appalachian Triangle is perhaps most visible. James Whitfield was a 61-year-old retired park ranger who had spent 34 years working in the Smokies. He knew every trail, every overlook, every drainage. After retirement, he continued to volunteer with the park's interpretive programs, leading guided hikes and educating visitors about the natural history of the region. On June 8, 2024, Whitfield left his home near Gatlinburg for a solo hike to Charley's Bunyan, a rocky outcrop along the Appalachian Trail that he had visited hundreds of times. He told his wife he wanted to see the sunrise from the overlook. He parked at the Newfound Gap parking area at 4:30 a.m. and signed the trail register. His headlamp was noted by another early hiker who saw him starting up the trail. At 6:15 a.m., Whitfield's wife received a text message. "Made it. Light is perfect. This never gets old." That was his last communication. When Whitfield did not return by afternoon, his wife contacted park rangers. They located his vehicle and began a search. Over the following week, more than 70 searchers covered the trail between Newfound Gap and Charley's Bunyan. Dogs tracked his scent from the overlook back along the trail for approximately half a mile, then lost it at a junction where a side path led toward a spring. Rangers walked the side path. It ended at the spring, a small pool surrounded by rocks. Whitfield's water bottle was sitting on one of the rocks, half full. There was no other sign of him. The spring was a location Whitfield knew well. He had mentioned it in guided hikes as one of his favorite places to rest. He had told visitors that the water was the clearest he had ever seen. Searchers examined every inch of the area around the spring. They found no footprints leading away, no broken vegetation, no indication of which direction Whitfield might have gone after filling his water bottle. James Whitfield was never found. His colleagues at the park were devastated. Many had worked with him for decades. They could not understand how a man who had spent his life in these mountains could simply vanish from a place he had visited more times than he could count. His wife gave one statement to the press. She said James had been healthy and happy. He had no reason to harm himself. He had been planning a trip to visit their grandchildren the following week. She said the last text message he sent still sits on her phone. She reads it sometimes, late at night. She looks at those words and tries to understand how a man can be standing in a place he loves, watching the light come up over the mountains, and then simply cease to exist. She does not have an answer. Neither do the investigators. Neither does the forest. Across these cases, the same elements appear again and again. Experienced people, familiar terrain, clear weather, proper equipment, and then absence. Complete and total absence, as if the person stepped through a door that closed behind them. The Appalachian Triangle does not offer explanations. It offers only patterns. Footprints that stop in the middle of trails, scent trails that end at creek beds and rock walls, belongings that appear in locations already searched, and silence. Always silence, where there should be answers. But the disappearances continue. The names accumulate. The following case occurred in the fall of 2024 and involves a detail that has not been made public until now. Victor Haynes was a 44-year-old cartographer who worked for the United States Geological Survey. He had spent 15 years mapping terrain in the Appalachian region, often hiking into areas that did not appear on any existing chart. His colleagues described him as obsessive about accuracy, the kind of man who would walk an extra mile to verify a contour line. On September 28, 2024, Haynes entered the Monongahela National Forest in West Virginia to verify mapping data for a section of the Dolly Sods Wilderness. He carried GPS equipment, a satellite phone, and detailed notes about discrepancies he had identified between aerial surveys and ground-level observations. At 11:30 a.m., he called his supervisor to report that he had reached the coordinates in question. He said the terrain did not match either the aerial data or the previous ground survey. He described a narrow valley that appeared on no existing map. His supervisor asked him to take photographs and mark the location for follow-up. Haynes acknowledged and said he was going to walk the perimeter of the valley to estimate its dimensions. That was his last communication. When Haynes did not check in by evening, his supervisor contacted the Forest Service. Rangers located his vehicle at the trailhead the following morning. His GPS equipment was found approximately 2 miles from the vehicle, sitting on a flat rock beside a creek. The device was still powered on. The screen showed a route that ended at a point marked Valley Entrance. Beyond that point, no data had been recorded. Searchers followed the route to the marked location. They found a section of terrain that matched Haynes's description. A narrow depression between 2 ridges, heavily wooded, with steep walls on 3 sides. The valley was not visible on any satellite image or topographic map. Dogs tracked Haynes's scent into the valley for approximately 300 yards. The trail ended at the base of a rock wall that showed no obvious passage or opening. Handlers circled the wall multiple times. The scent did not continue in any direction. Over the next 11 days, more than 40 searchers covered the valley and the surrounding terrain. They found a single item, Haynes's field notebook, lying open on the ground near the rock wall. The last entry was dated September 28th. It read, "Valley dimensions approximately 400 yards by 200 yards. Walls average 60 feet. No outlet visible. Acoustics unusual. Voice does not echo, absorbs instead. Trees older than surrounding forest. Species mix inconsistent with elevation. Note, compass reading 12 degrees off expected. Will investigate northwest corner. There was no entry describing what he found in the northwest corner. Victor Haynes was never found. His satellite phone was never recovered. The valley he documented has since been visited by survey teams, but none have been able to explain why it does not appear on any map, or why his compass showed a deviation in an area with no known magnetic anomalies. His supervisor later said, "Victor spent his career making sure the maps were accurate. He found something that wasn't on any map, and now he's not on any map either." Another case comes from the Tennessee side of the triangle and involves a woman whose instincts had saved lives in the past. Barbara Nolan was a 56-year-old emergency dispatcher for the Cocke County 911 Center. She had worked the phones for 28 years, coordinating responses to accidents, fires, and medical emergencies in the rural communities along the North Carolina border. Her colleagues said she had a sixth sense for trouble, an ability to hear things in callers' voices that told her when a situation was worse than it appeared. On July 14, 2023, Nolan took a personal day to hike a section of the Appalachian Trail near Max Patch, a bald summit known for its panoramic views. She had hiked the area many times and told her husband she needed a day in the mountains to clear her head after a difficult week at work. She parked at the trailhead at 8 a.m. and signed the register. Another hiker saw her on the trail around 9:30 a.m., heading toward the summit. She appeared relaxed and waved as she passed. At 11:15 a.m., Nolan called her husband from the summit. She said the view was beautiful and she was going to take some photographs before heading back. He could hear wind in the background, but nothing else unusual. At 11:47 a.m., she called again. This time her voice was different, lower, more controlled. She said, "I need you to listen carefully. I'm going to describe exactly where I am. Write it down." Her husband grabbed a pen. She gave him coordinates, trail markers, and a description of the terrain. Then she said, "Something is wrong here. I don't know how to explain it. The trail behind me looks different than it did when I came up. I'm going to try the other direction." He asked her what she meant. She said, "The path I walked is gone. There's just trees now. I can see where it should be, but it's not there." The call lasted another 43 seconds. During that time, she described walking toward what she thought was an alternate route. Her breathing became heavier. Then she said, "Oh, that's not right." The line went silent. The call did not disconnect for another 12 seconds. Her husband called back immediately. The phone rang once and went to voicemail. The search that followed was one of the largest in recent years for the area. More than 90 people covered the terrain around Max Patch over 8 days. Dogs tracked her scent from the summit in multiple directions, but none of the trails extended more than 200 yards before fading. Her phone was found on the 6th day, lying in tall grass approximately half a mile from the summit. The screen was cracked, but the device was functional. The last outgoing call matched her husband's account. There were no additional calls or messages. No other trace of Barbara Nolan was ever found. Her husband shared the recording of their final conversation with investigators. The audio quality was poor due to wind noise, but her words were clear enough. When asked what he thought she meant by "the path is gone," he said he had no idea. He said Barbara was not a person who exaggerated or imagined things. If she said the trail had disappeared, she meant it literally. He said the last thing she said, "That's not right," has stayed with him. He hears it every night before he falls asleep. He does not know what she saw. He only knows she sounded like someone who had just realized something terrible. The next case brings us to the present day, and a disappearance that remains under active investigation. Thomas Chen was a 32-year-old data analyst from Roanoke who had recently developed an interest in the missing 411 phenomenon. He had read extensively about disappearances in national parks and wilderness areas, and he maintained a blog where he analyzed patterns in the cases and proposed theories about their causes. On January 6, 2025, Chen drove to the Jefferson National Forest to visit several locations associated with documented disappearances. He told a friend he was conducting field research and planned to photograph the sites and take environmental readings. His last blog post, published the morning of his trip, read, "Heading into the Triangle today." People ask me why I research this. I tell them the same thing. If there's a pattern, it can be understood. If it can be understood, it can be predicted. And if it can be predicted, maybe we can stop losing people to it. I'll post updates tonight. There were no updates. Chen's vehicle was found at a trailhead near Big Stone Gap on January 8th, after his friend reported him overdue. His camera and notebook were in the vehicle. His phone was missing. Search teams covered the area for 9 days. Dogs tracked his scent from the parking area along a trail for approximately 1 mile, then lost it at a junction. Handlers reported that the scent ended at the junction and did not continue along any of the 3 paths that branched from it. On the 7th day, a searcher found a handwritten note tucked under a rock near the junction. The handwriting matched Chen's. The note read, 1:47 p.m. at the junction from the Whitmore case. Trail to the northeast matches his description. Going to walk it and document. If anyone finds this, I went northeast. Follow. Searchers walked the northeast trail multiple times. It led to a dead end at a rock wall approximately half a mile from the junction. There was no sign of Chen along the route or at the wall. The reference to the Whitmore case was significant. Curtis Whitmore, the ranger who disappeared in 1980, was among the earliest documented cases in the Appalachian Triangle. His file mentioned a junction near Keokee Lake. The location where Chen's note was found matched that description. Thomas Chen was researching the disappearances. He found the same junction where a man had vanished 45 years earlier. And then, he vanished himself. His final blog post remains online. The comment section has filled with messages from readers asking for updates. No updates have come. One of his final research notes, recovered from his vehicle, contained a list of commonalities he had identified across dozens of cases. 1. Experienced individuals, familiar with terrain. 2. Clear weather, no obvious environmental hazard. 3. Scent trails that end abruptly, not gradually. 4. Items appearing in previously searched locations. 5. Time of day clusters. Late morning, early afternoon. 6. Proximity to water sources at last known location. 7. Reports of unusual sounds preceding disappearance. 8. Compass and GPS anomalies in some cases. 9. Witnesses report victim looking or listening toward something unseen. 10. No evidence of animal predation or human violence. Below the list, Chen had written a single sentence. The pattern exists. The explanation does not. Yet. One final case deserves mention, though it differs from the others in one crucial respect. The missing person returned. In October 2019, a 51-year-old forestry technician named Dale Hutchins disappeared during a routine survey in the Cherokee National Forest. He was marking trees for a timber assessment when he failed to return to the field station at the end of his shift. Search teams found his vehicle and equipment at the work site. His lunch was still in his pack, untouched. Dogs tracked his scent for approximately 400 yards into the forest before losing it at a creek bed. 3 days later, Hutchins walked out of the forest near a campground 11 miles from where he had disappeared. He was disoriented, dehydrated, and missing his boots. He had no memory of how he had traveled 11 miles through dense forest in 3 days, much of it over terrain that would be difficult to navigate even with proper equipment. Medical evaluation found no evidence of head trauma, stroke, or other conditions that might explain the memory loss. Toxicology tests were negative. Hutchins was physically healthy, though severely fatigued. In interviews with investigators, he could recall only fragments of the 3 days. He remembered walking. He remembered being cold at night. He remembered a sound that he described as like a radio tuned between stations, a continuous static that seemed to come from everywhere at once. He could not explain how he had crossed 2 ridges and a river without remembering any of it. He could not explain why his boots were missing or where he had left them. He could not explain the 11 miles. When asked if he had seen anyone else during his time in the forest, Hutchins was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I don't know. I feel like I wasn't alone, but I can't remember faces or voices. Just the feeling that someone was walking beside me. showing me where to go. He returned to work 6 weeks later. Colleagues said he was different afterward, quieter. He requested a transfer to a position that did not require solo field work. He refused to discuss what had happened in the forest. 3 years later, he retired early. He moved to Florida, as far from the Appalachian Mountains as he could get without leaving the country. He has never spoken publicly about his experience. But his case suggests something that the other cases cannot, that whatever takes people in the Appalachian Triangle does not always keep them. Sometimes, for reasons that remain unclear, it lets them go. The question is why, and the answer, like everything else in the Triangle, remains hidden. The rangers who work in the Appalachian Triangle have their own stories. Most are reluctant to share them publicly, but in private conversations, certain themes emerge. A retired ranger from the Great Smoky Mountains, who requested anonymity, described an experience from 1997. He was searching for a missing hiker near Clingman's Dome when he encountered a stretch of trail that he did not recognize, despite having walked it dozens of times. The trees were wrong, he said. Same species, same size, but arranged differently, like someone had picked them up and put them back in the wrong order. I walked about 100 yards before I realized what was happening. Then I turned around and went back the way I came. When I looked over my shoulder, the trail I had just walked was normal again. He did not report the incident. He did not know how. Another ranger, who worked in the Jefferson National Forest for 17 years, described finding footprints during a search that appeared to walk in a circle. Not a large circle, just 5 or 6 steps, turning around and around in the same spot, as if the person had been spinning in place. The prints were fresh, she said, made within hours of when I found them. But there was no trail leading in and no trail leading out, just the circle. I marked it and called it in, but by the time the team arrived, the prints were gone. Not covered up. Gone. The ground was undisturbed. She transferred to a different district the following year. The locals who have lived in the Triangle for generations speak with more acceptance and less surprise. They have grown up with the stories. They know which hollows to avoid after dark. They know which ridges carry sounds that do not belong to animals or weather. An elderly woman in Weiss County, Virginia, whose family has lived in the area since the 1800s, explained it simply. The mountains were here before us. They'll be here after us. They don't owe us an explanation for anything they do. When asked what she thought happened to the people who disappeared, she said, "Some places want to be left alone. Sometimes people stumble into them without meaning to, and sometimes those places don't let them stumble back out." She was not speaking metaphorically. She meant it as a statement of fact, as certain as the weather or the turning of the seasons. Across these documented cases, certain patterns emerge with a consistency that defies easy explanation. The victims are not unprepared or inexperienced. They are rangers, hunters, biologists, military veterans, search and rescue volunteers, and outdoor professionals who have spent years or decades in the wilderness. The terrain where they vanish is not unusually dangerous. It is familiar ground that they have walked many times before. They disappear on clear days, in good weather, along trails they know by heart. The tracking dogs tell the same story again and again. The scent trail continues for a distance, sometimes 100 yards, sometimes half a mile, then stops. Not fades, stops, as if the person simply ceased to exist at that point. Personal items appear in locations that have already been searched. Radios are found wedged into crevices. Water bottles sit on rocks. Notebooks lie open to final entries. The objects are placed, not dropped. They suggest intention, though the intention remains unclear. And in several cases, there are sounds. Voices calling names. Humming that does not match the wind. Footsteps that move away from camp in the middle of the night. The witnesses describe these sounds with the same steady tone. They do not claim to understand them. They only report what they heard. The theories that attempt to explain these patterns fall into several categories. The first is simple misadventure. People become disoriented. They make poor decisions. They fall into ravines or sinkholes or underground caves that swallow their bodies beyond recovery. The wilderness is vast and unforgiving, and even experienced people can be overwhelmed by its scale. This theory explains some cases. It does not explain why the scent trails end so abruptly, or why items appear in searched locations, or why so many of the missing were intimately familiar with the terrain where they vanished. The second theory involves criminal activity, serial predators operating in remote areas, illegal operations, drug manufacturing, poaching networks that eliminate witnesses, human trafficking routes that pass through wilderness corridors. This theory has been investigated extensively. No evidence has linked any of the documented cases to criminal networks. No suspects have been identified. No bodies have been found showing signs of violence. The third theory involves environmental factors that are not yet fully understood. Magnetic anomalies that affect navigation and cognition, infrasound generated by wind patterns or geological activity that induces disorientation and panic, toxic gases released from underground deposits that cause hallucinations and impaired judgment. Some of these factors have been documented in specific locations. None have been consistently present across all the cases in the Appalachian Triangle, and none explain the stopped scent trails or the appearing objects. The fourth theory is the one that researchers are most reluctant to discuss publicly. It suggests that certain locations in the wilderness operate according to rules that we do not yet understand, that the terrain itself is not stable in the way we assume, that paths can change, that distances can shift, that a person can walk into a familiar forest and find themselves somewhere else entirely. This theory has no scientific support. It cannot be tested or falsified. It exists only in the margins of investigation reports, in the private conversations of search and rescue veterans, in the quiet warnings that locals pass down through generations. And yet, when a man who has mapped terrain for 15 years finds a valley that does not exist on any chart, and then vanishes within it, when a woman calls her husband to say the trail behind her has disappeared, and then stops mid-sentence, when a researcher visits the junction where a ranger vanished 45 years earlier, and then vanishes himself, the questions remain. The Appalachian Triangle does not answer questions. It accumulates them, case by case, year by year, name by name. The searches continue. Every spring, when the snow melts, teams return to the locations where the missing were last documented. They walk the same trails. They call the same names. Sometimes they find remains, a bone fragment, a piece of clothing that provides closure for a family. More often, they find nothing. The technology available to search teams has improved dramatically over the decades. Thermal imaging cameras can detect body heat through forest canopy. Drones equipped with high-resolution sensors can cover terrain that would take ground teams days to search. GPS coordinates can be shared in real time. Cell phone pings can be triangulated to narrow search areas. And yet the recovery rate for missing persons in the Appalachian Triangle has not improved significantly. A search and rescue coordinator from Tennessee, who has participated in more than 50 operations in the region, offered his perspective. The technology helps when we know where to look. The problem is that these cases don't give us anywhere to start. The scent trail ends. The GPS stops recording. The phone goes silent. We can cover 10 square miles in a day now instead of 2. But if the person isn't in those 10 square miles, it doesn't matter how fast we search. He paused before adding, "Some of the old-timers I worked with when I started, they used to say that certain parts of these mountains don't want to be searched. I used to think that was superstition. After 30 years, I'm not so sure." The psychological toll on search teams is rarely discussed publicly. Volunteers and professionals alike carry the weight of the operations they could not close. They remember the names. They remember the families waiting at the command post. They remember the moment when the decision was made to scale back, to move from rescue to recovery, to eventually suspend active operations. A volunteer from Virginia described it this way: "You keep thinking you're going to find them around the next bend. You keep thinking the dogs are going to pick up the trail again. And then the days pass, and the weather turns, and you realize that whoever you're looking for is gone in a way that doesn't leave a trail to follow." She has continued volunteering for 15 years. When asked why, she said, "Because maybe the next one will be different. Maybe the next one we'll find in time. You can't stop looking just because the mountains make it hard." The families wait. Some have waited decades. They maintain websites and social media pages. They post photographs and descriptions. They ask hikers to keep their eyes open. They do not give up because giving up means accepting that their loved one is simply gone, absorbed by a landscape that will not explain itself. The daughter of Harold Birkhart, the retired game warden who disappeared in 2012, still visits the area where her father was last seen. She hikes the same trails he walked. She checks the same spots where he placed his trail cameras. "I don't expect to find him anymore," she said in a recent interview, "but I feel closer to him out there. I feel like I understand something about what drew him to those mountains, even if I'll never understand what happened to him." The wife of Paul Garrett, who vanished in 2017 after hearing his name called, has become an advocate for improved search protocols in wilderness areas. She speaks at conferences and consults with search teams. She has helped develop training materials for families of the missing. "The hardest part is the not knowing," she said. "You can grieve a death. You can bury someone and visit their grave. But when someone just disappears, there's no closure. There's just this endless waiting for a call that might never come." She still carries her phone with her everywhere, even at night, just in case. The brother of Curtis Whitmore, the ranger who vanished in 1980, passed away in 2019 without ever learning what happened. Before his death, he told a local newspaper, "I stopped hoping for answers a long time ago. But I never stopped wondering. Every time I walk past those mountains, I look up at the ridges and I think about Curtis. I think about what he might have seen, and I hope that wherever he is, he found some peace." The forest remains. It does not change to accommodate human expectations. It does not reveal what it has taken. It simply continues, season after season, indifferent to the names that have been added to its record. If you have followed these accounts, you have heard the names. People who walked into the Appalachian Triangle, most who did not walk out, and one who returned with no memory of where he had been. Some were searching for peace. Some were searching for answers. Some were just doing their jobs. None of them expected to become part of the pattern they were studying or the landscape they loved. The question remains unanswered. What happens to people who vanish in these mountains? The honest answer is that we do not know. We have patterns. We have theories. We have the steady accumulation of documented cases that share features too consistent to be coincidental and too strange to be explained. What we do not have is certainty. Perhaps that is the point. Perhaps the Appalachian Triangle persists as a mystery because mysteries are how the wilderness reminds us of our limits. We have mapped every mountain. We have named every peak. We have built trails and shelters and rescue systems. And still, people vanish. Not because the wilderness is hostile, not because it wishes us harm, but because it is vast and old and operates according to principles we have not yet learned to read. The locals say, "Walk with others. Stay on marked paths. If the forest grows too still, move on. And if something calls your name, keep walking." They do not say these things to frighten. They say them because generations of experience have taught them that the mountains deserve respect. That familiarity is not the same as safety. That a place you have walked 100 times can become unfamiliar in an instant. If you hike in the Appalachian Triangle, you will probably be fine. Millions of people visit these mountains every year and return home without incident. The odds are overwhelmingly in your favor. But if you find yourself on a familiar trail and something feels different, the light, the sound, the space between the trees, pay attention. Do not dismiss the feeling. Do not tell yourself that you are imagining things. The people in these cases were not imagining things. They noticed something wrong, and then they were gone. This investigation does not end with answers. It ends with names. Names that deserve to be remembered. People who are still out there, somewhere in the spaces between the maps. And one who came back, carrying a silence he cannot explain. If you know someone who hikes these trails, share this with them. Not to frighten them, but to remind them that the wilderness is not a park or a playground. It is a place where the rules we take for granted do not always apply. And if you have information about any of the cases documented here, any sighting, any detail, any piece of evidence that might help bring someone home, contact the National Park Service Investigative Services branch at their tip line. Every detail matters. Every lead is followed. Because somewhere in these mountains, the missing are waiting to be found, and the forest, as always, keeps its own counsel. Some researchers have attempted to quantify the phenomenon. They have mapped the locations of disappearances, looking for clusters. They have analyzed the timing, searching for patterns related to seasons, weather, or lunar cycles. They have compiled lists of commonalities, hoping to identify risk factors that could help prevent future cases. The data reveals correlations, but not causes. Disappearances cluster in certain areas, but those areas are also among the most visited, which may simply reflect the number of people passing through. The timing shows slight peaks in spring and fall, but those are also the most popular hiking seasons. The one finding that stands out is the profile of the victims. Unlike most missing persons cases, which disproportionately involve the young, the elderly, or those with medical conditions, the Appalachian Triangle cases show no such pattern. The missing are healthy, experienced, and prepared. They are precisely the people who should be least likely to become lost or injured in the wilderness. This finding has led some researchers to suggest that whatever is happening in the Triangle is not simply the result of human error or environmental hazard. Something else is at work, something that selects for competence rather than vulnerability. What that something might be remains the central mystery. The indigenous peoples who lived in these mountains for thousands of years before European settlement left no written records of their beliefs about the land. But the oral traditions that survive speak of places where the boundary between worlds was thin, where spirits moved freely, where a person could step from one reality into another without meaning to. The Cherokee called certain locations darkening land, places where the sun did not reach even at midday, where the trees grew in ways that did not follow natural patterns, where travelers were advised to pass quickly and without looking back. Whether these traditions reflect actual experiences or simply the human tendency to mythologize the unknown is impossible to determine. But they suggest that the strangeness of the Appalachian Triangle was recognized long before the first missing person report was filed. The mountains have been here for 400 million years. They have seen ice ages and extinctions. They have watched species rise and fall. They have endured earthquakes, floods, and fires. On that timescale, human presence is barely a flicker. Perhaps what we call the Appalachian Triangle is simply the mountains reminding us of this fact, a reminder that we are visitors in a place we do not fully understand and cannot fully control. Or perhaps there is something more, something that the cases documented here suggest, but cannot prove, something that the rangers whisper about and the locals accept without question, something that waits in the spaces between the trees for the next person to walk a familiar path and find it suddenly, inexplicably, changed. The next time you walk a trail you know by heart, take a moment to look around. Notice how the light falls through the trees. Listen to the sounds between the silences. Feel the ground beneath your feet. And remember the names of those who walked these paths before you and did not return. The Appalachian Triangle is real. The disappearances are documented. The questions remain open. And the mountains will be there. Either way, waiting, watching, keeping their secrets in the spaces where the maps end and the unknown begins.